The first thing Celia noticed every morning was her hands. Not the alarm, not the gray light coming through the motel curtains, which had been replaced months ago by the gray light coming through the back seat windows of a 2014 Ford Explorer with 140,000 miles and a slow leak in the rear left tire. Not the sound of Rosie breathing through her mouth the way she always did when she was deeply asleep. The small, wet rhythm of a 7-year-old who trusted the world completely because nobody had told her yet not to. The hands. She would hold them up in whatever light was available and look at them the way she used to look at a patient's chart before a shift. Assessing, cataloging. These hands had started IVs in moving ambulances, had pressed hard and steady on a chest in the 32 seconds between one heartbeat and the next, had held things that needed holding and let go of things that needed letting go, and had known without being told the difference between the two. They were good hands. They were capable hands. They were also cracked at the knuckles from dish soap that cost $1.89 for a bottle that lasted 11 days. And there was a permanent coffee stain on the inside of her right thumb from 6 months of steaming milk at $7 an hour. And the left index finger had a small scar from a box cutter she'd been using to open a case of paper towels at the office cleaning job, and it had slipped and she'd pressed a paper napkin to it and kept going because she had 4 more floors to do before 2 a.m. They were good hands, they were just tired. Outside the car, October in Riverton, a parking lot behind a Kroger that closed at midnight and didn't open again until 6, which gave them a 6-hour window of being somewhere without being asked to leave. Celia had learned the windows. The windows were important. She had learned them the way she had learned everything in the past 4 weeks, by paying attention, by adapting, by refusing to spend more than 30 seconds being upset about a situation once the situation was clear and required a response. You could be upset or you could respond. You could not do both at the same time, not in a way that worked. She chose response. Every morning, she chose response. 4 weeks since the eviction notice had arrived at the house on Clement Street. Not their house, technically. It had never been their house. It had been Derek's house, and then Derek's debt, and then the bank's house, and then the bank's decision, all of which had happened while Celia was working the morning shift and picking up Rosie from school and helping Tilly with long division and listening to Nadia practice for the debate team and doing all the things you did when you believed the floor was going to hold. The floor did not hold. Derek had been gone for 11 months by then. Not gone like dead. She would think sometimes about how the language worked, the distinction between the kinds of gone. Gone like a ship that changed course in the dark and stopped sending signals. He had not called, he had not written. He had sent through a lawyer who clearly found the whole thing distasteful, a single document dissolving the marriage, and a note that said he was sorry, and that there was nothing left which was accurate. There was nothing left. Not the savings account, or the retirement fund, or the business, or the man she had thought she knew. She had thought she knew him for 9 years. She had been wrong for some portion of those 9 years without knowing it. And the question of how long she had been wrong was one she had made herself stop asking because it did not have an answer that changed anything. And it used up energy she needed for other things. There had been $3,000 in a savings account. She'd kept separate money from shifts she'd worked during Tilly's first year of school when she thought she might go back to nursing full-time. She'd spent $1,900 of it on first and last month's rent for a 2-bedroom apartment on Hartwell Avenue. She'd spent $600 on the deposit. She'd spent the rest on groceries and utilities in the school supplies Nadia needed and the shoes Rosie had outgrown. That had been September. This was October. She was 34 years old, and she was sleeping in her car in a Kroger parking lot, and her nursing certification had lapsed 14 months ago during the year she'd spent at home, and the recertification costs were approximately $2,000 she did not have. And she was working 2 jobs that together paid slightly more than minimum wage, and she had 3 daughters who believed because she told them every single day that this was temporary. She meant it when she said it. She also knew that meaning something and it being true were different categories of thing. Nadia didn't believe her. Nadia was 12 and had their grandmother's eyes and had stopped believing things on faith approximately 8 months ago. She believed evidence. She believed math. She had done the math on their situation with the quiet thoroughness of someone who had decided that if nobody else was going to look at the numbers, she would. And the numbers were not good. She never said this out loud. She just portioned the cereal boxes every morning with the precision of a rationing officer dividing what was left into 3 equal servings without being asked, making sure Tilly and Rosie got theirs first. She did it casually. The way you did things you'd been doing so long they stopped feeling like sacrifice and started feeling like routine. Celia watched her do it every morning and felt something in her chest that didn't have a clean name. It was not grief exactly. It was not pride exactly. It was the specific sensation of seeing your child understand something you had hoped they wouldn't need to understand, yet something about the world being smaller than you had promised it was going to be, and watching them adapt to the smallness without complaint. It was the most heartbreaking kind of competence. Tilly was 10 and drew houses in her notebooks. Not their house on Clement Street, which she'd stopped drawing the day the movers came. New houses, dream houses really, with 2 stories and a porch and a garden and a tree in the front yard, with a tire swing that Celia had never had growing up and Tilly had seen in a book somewhere and decided was essential. She drew them in the back seat of the Explorer with a set of colored pencils she'd been given for her birthday in June and treated with the careful attention usually reserved for surgical instruments. She never asked when they'd have one. She just drew them, filed them away in the folder she kept behind the front seat. Added details each week: shutters, a mailbox, a cat in the window, a garden with rows of something growing, though she never labeled what. It was Celia understood a practice of faith. Tilly was 10 years old, and she was practicing faith in the form of colored pencil houses with tire swings, and the practice was so earnest and so persistent that it broke Celia's heart in exactly the kind of way that also strengthened it. Rosie was 7 and had decided somewhere around week 2 of the car situation that they were on a camping trip, an extended one, an adventure. She had embraced this interpretation with a 7-year-old's complete commitment to the narrative that made the most sense to her, and she had begun referring to the Explorer as the camping car, and the Kroger parking lot as our campsite, and the truck stop showers as the outdoor bathroom, which was actually a reasonable description. Celia had not corrected her. She would have to eventually, but not yet, not today. Today was Tuesday, which meant the morning shift at Dunleavy's Coffee on 3rd Street, and then 4 hours at the house on Clement Street that wasn't theirs anymore, packing the last of the boxes the movers hadn't taken, and then picking up Rosie from the after-school program at Garrison Elementary, and then figuring out dinner on a budget of approximately $12, and then the overnight cleaning shift at the Harwick building downtown from 10 to 2. She would sleep in the parking lot from 2:30 to 5:45. Then she would do it again. She did not think about the week after this week. She had discovered sometime in September that thinking about the week after this week made it impossible to function. So she thought about today, only today. She woke up every morning and made a list of what today required, and then she did those things one after another until the day was over and she could sleep. It was not a good system. It was the only system she had. The coffee shop was on 3rd and Aldine, a block and a half from the bus stop where Nadia caught the 7:15 to Fairview Middle School. They had worked out a morning routine with the precision of a military operation. Celia dropped Tilly and Rosie at Garrison at 7 o'clock, Nadia at the bus stop at 7:12, and was behind the counter at Dunleavy's by 7:25. Their manager, a thin man named Garrett, who believed in punctuality with the fervor of a convert, had noted twice that she looked tired during her shifts. She had not explained. There was no explanation that would make the situation better, and explanations that didn't make situations better were a category of speech she had been steadily eliminating from her life. She was wiping down the counter at 9:47 on a Tuesday morning when the customer at the window table left. He left behind a newspaper. Not unusual. People left newspapers at Dunleavy's all the time. They left newspapers and receipts and occasionally umbrellas and once a set of car keys that nobody ever came back for. Celia's job was to clear the table, which she did stacking the cup and the saucer and picking up the newspaper to drop in the recycling bin by the door. She had it in her hand. She would have dropped it in the bin and gone back to the counter, and that would have been the entire story. Except that as she folded it, she happened to look at the classified section, and in the lower right corner in a box the size of a business card was an ad in small print that she read once and then read again because the first reading didn't make sense. House for sale. $1. Must see to believe. Cash only. 1247 Maple Street. She stood at the recycling bin with the newspaper in her hands. A dollar house had to be condemned. A dollar house had to be a scam. A dollar house had to be one of those situations where you paid a dollar and then discovered you'd also purchased $100,000 of code violations and structural damage and liability. A dollar house was not a real thing. A dollar house was the kind of thing people passed around online as evidence that the economy had become absurd. She knew this. She folded the paper carefully and put it in her apron pocket. The house at 1247 Maple Street was 8 blocks from Dunleavy's, which meant she could walk there and back in her lunch break if she moved quickly. She moved quickly. She took Nadia and Tilly and Rosie with her because she had nowhere to leave them, and she held Rosie's hand and Nadia held Tilly's, and they walked the 8 blocks in the specific formation they developed over the past 4 weeks, a loose cluster that looked casual from the outside and was actually extremely organized. The street grew quieter as they went. The houses got older. Every third property looked like it had given up sometime in the previous decade and had been waiting since then for someone to make a decision about it, waiting with the particular patience of structures which had no choice but to wait and were therefore very good at it. 1247 Maple was at the end of the block. It was a Victorian, or it had been once. The bones were still there. The high roof, the wraparound porch, the window shapes that suggested another era entirely. But the paint had come off in long strips that curled at the edges like old bandages. The porch sagged on the left side with the particular resignation of wood that has held too much weight for too long. Every window was either cracked or boarded. The yard was a density of weeds and fallen branches that came up past Rosie's shoulder. Rosie pressed against Celia's leg. Tilly's eyes went wide. Even Nadia, who rarely showed things, looked doubtful. A rusted for sale sign dangled from one chain, turning slowly in the October wind, making no sound. Rosie whispered, "It looks haunted." Tilly said, "It's so old." Celia said, "It looks like it needs someone." She didn't know why she said it that way. She was looking at the house and she was thinking about bones, not the way a person thought about bones who was afraid, but the way a person thought about bones who had spent years learning to read them. The foundation was stone, the old kind cut and mortared before anyone had thought about building codes or seismic retrofitting. Whatever was wrong with this house, it wasn't the foundation. She could see it from the street. Foundations held or they didn't. This one held. She had looked at enough things that didn't hold to know the difference. The elderly man came from the house next door. He moved carefully the way people moved when they learned that rushing led to consequences. He was wearing a corduroy jacket that had been good quality once and a pair of slacks that were clean and pressed. He had a wooden cane and the eyes of someone who had watched his neighborhood change by degrees over 30 years and had decided to keep watching rather than leave. His name was Frank Aldridge. She would learn this in the next 4 minutes. She would spend the next several months understanding that Frank Aldridge was one of those people who appeared at specific moments in a story and said exactly the things that needed saying without ornamentation. Not because he was wise in any dramatic way, but because he had been paying attention for long enough that he knew what information mattered and what didn't, and he gave you the information that mattered without the parts that didn't. He looked at Celia. He looked at the 3 girls. He looked at the Explorer parked at the curb with the sleeping bags visible through the rear window and the laundry bag wedged against the back seat and all the accumulated evidence of people who were living somewhere that was not a house. He said, "You see the ad?" She said, "Yes." He said, "City's been trying to sell it for 3 years. Last owner was a woman named Ivy Keene. No kids, no husband, no will worth talking about. Taxes unpaid since she got sick. They want someone to take responsibility for it so they can stop paying to keep the lawn from completely taking over. That's what the dollar is. That's all it is. She said, "What's wrong with it?" He said, "Foundation's solid. That's the good news. It's built on bedrock original stone, which is why it's still standing after everything. But the roof leaks in 4 places I can count from here. Plumbing is from the 40s and not the good kind of 40s. Electrical is worse. The basement floods every spring because the drainage system is original, and original in this context means it predates the concept of adequate drainage." He paused. He said, "There's probably asbestos in the walls." She looked at the house. He said anybody with $50,000 in their pocket isn't looking at dollar houses. And anybody looking at a dollar house usually doesn't have what it takes to do what needs doing. He said it without judgment, just as information. The way a person delivered information when they'd learned that the information itself was enough and that adding interpretation to it was usually wrong. She looked at the house for another moment. Rosie was still pressed against her leg. Tilly had taken out her pencil and was studying the roofline with the expression of someone taking notes. Nadia was doing the quiet arithmetic she always did, calculating something Celia couldn't see, arriving at conclusions she would not share until they were fully formed. Celia said, "I used to be a nurse." Frank looked at her. She said, "I know how to tell when something is worth fighting for, even when it looks bad from the outside." Frank was quiet for a moment. He looked at the house. He looked at her. He looked at the girls again, at the careful formation of them, at the way Nadia was standing between Tilly and the street without appearing to be doing it deliberately. He said, "City Hall closes at 4:30. If you're serious, I used to work in the assessor's office. I know the process." She was serious. The transaction at City Hall took 2 hours and had the quality of a dream that was slightly too strange to be entirely believed. A clerk with reading glasses and a dry sense of humor shuffled through paperwork that smelled like a filing cabinet from 1987. Celia signed documents she had to read 3 times each, not because the language was difficult, but because she needed to understand exactly what she was agreeing to. She had learned in nursing school and in a marriage and in a bankruptcy she hadn't seen coming that the thing that got you was always the thing you hadn't read carefully. She paid $1 in cash from the emergency folded bill she kept in the inner pocket of her wallet, the one she'd kept there since nursing school, as a kind of superstition, a reminder that she had survived lean times before and would again. When the clerk handed her the key, he smirked. He said, "Good luck with the mansion." He was trying to be funny. He was not wrong that the word mansion was absurd in this context. He just didn't understand what a key felt like when you hadn't had one in 4 weeks, when you had been sleeping in a Kroger parking lot and telling your 7-year-old you were on a camping trip, when you had been doing the math on cereal boxes every morning and the math kept not working. A key felt like a door, which was all a key was, but that was everything. She put the key in her pocket and walked out into the October afternoon with $87 in her checking account and a deed to a house on Maple Street. That night was the first night. There was no electricity, there was no running water, there was no heat, and October in Riverton had decided to remind everyone that it was genuinely October, which meant the temperature dropped into the 40s after dark, and the boarded windows did not, it turned out, provide much insulation. They had sleeping bags. She had bought 2 sleeping bags at a thrift store in August for $4 each. The good ones, the ones meant for real camping. And they had been in the back of the Explorer for 2 months, and now they were on the living room floor of 1247 Maple Street, and Celia was burning the last of a pack of birthday candles she'd found in the emergency kit she kept in the glove compartment. The dancing light made the peeling wallpaper look like faces, not threatening, just present. The suggestion of people who had lived here before their presence, absorbed into the paper and the plaster and the old wood of the floors. Rosie was pressed into Celia's side, burrowed her small body warm and solid. She smelled like the truck stop shampoo they'd been using, and something underneath that was just Rosie, the particular warmth of her, the smell of her sleep. She said, "Are we pioneers now?" Mama Celia said. Something like that. Rosie seemed satisfied with this. She was quiet for a moment, listening to the rain on the boarded windows. The sound was different from the rain on the car roof, deeper, more resonant, the sound of something substantial being rained on. Then Rosie said, "Mama, does our house have a ghost?" Celia kissed the top of her head. She said, "No, baby, no ghost." She said it easily, without hesitation. She would think about this later, that specific moment, that specific ease, and she would understand that you could say things without knowing what you were saying, and the things you said were true when you said them, and became something else afterward, and the afterward was what you had to learn to live with. Not the saying, the afterward. Nadia was in the other sleeping bag with Tilly, sharing the extra blanket they'd taken from the Explorer. Celia could hear her older daughter breathing in the particular pattern that meant she wasn't asleep, was thinking, was processing. She said, "Nadia." A pause. Then, "Yeah." She said, "Are you okay?" Another pause. Longer. Nadia said, "I'm okay." She wasn't asking permission, and she wasn't reassuring. She was just reporting. "I am okay. This is my status. You can note it and move on." It was the most Nadia thing she could have said, which was also the most heartbreaking thing, because 12-year-olds were not supposed to have learned yet to report their status with the neutrality of a person who had decided not to burden anyone. Celia noted it. Outside, the rain kept going. Inside, the candles burned down. The sleeping bags held heat better than the car had, which was something, which was not nothing. Celia lay in the dark and listened to her children breathe and thought about the foundation. Stone. Original. Built to hold. She slept. In the morning, she made a list. This was what she did. This had always been what she did, from nursing school, through 3 pregnancies, through the long, slow dissolution of her marriage, and the faster dissolution of everything after. She made lists. She identified the problems. She put them in order of urgency, and then she began working through them one at a time in the order they needed to go. The list was long. The roof was leaking in at least 4 places Frank could see from the street, which meant there were probably more he couldn't. The plumbing didn't work. The electrical system was according to Frank's professional assessment a fire hazard. The basement had a drainage problem. There was possible asbestos in the walls. Every window on the first floor needed work. The porch sagged on one side. The kitchen needed everything. The house needed approximately $50,000, and she had 87. She did not close the list. She enrolled the girls in Garrison Elementary and Fairview Middle School on the second day, using the Maple Street address for the first time, and feeling something shift in her chest when the registrar at Fairview wrote it down without looking up. An address, a place, a fact about where they lived that could be written down on a form without explanation or apology. She called Boone on the 3rd day. His name was Boone Calloway, and he had served 2 tours in the Marines and had come home to Riverton and learned to be a plumber because, as he told it, plumbing made sense in a way that a lot of things didn't. Water went in, water went out, and the job of the pipes was to manage that transaction. And if you understood that principle clearly and did the work correctly, the system held. He had said this to her once when she'd asked him why plumbing after the Marines, and she had understood immediately that he was talking about more than pipes. He owed her. This was not something she had planned to use, but she was past planning. 3 years ago, she had spent 4 months as the attending nurse for his mother, Dorothy Calloway, during a respiratory illness that had been serious and had stopped being serious. And this had not been Celia's doing exactly. Not the way miracles were anyone's doing. But Boone believed it had been, and he had said so, and he had said, "If you ever need anything." She had not called until now. She called now. He came on a Saturday morning in work clothes with a kit bag that looked like it had seen genuine use. He was a large man who moved carefully, the way large people sometimes learn to move when they'd spent time in spaces where size was a liability. He had brown eyes and the kind of face that registered things without announcing them. He went through the house methodically. The kitchen first, under the sink, up through the cabinet, into the wall. then the bathroom, then the basement door, which he opened and looked down into and immediately closed again. He said, "How much are you working with?" She said, "Nothing." He looked at her. She said, "I mean it. What are you seeing?" He said, "The pipes are lead, which is illegal and also a health hazard specifically for children under 6. The whole system needs to come out. New copper throughout. That's labor and materials." She said, "Number." He said, 8,000. And that's me doing it for cost. $8,000. She looked at the sink, at the faucet that ran rust-colored water for 30 seconds before anything close to clear came out, at the cabinet underneath it that had the water damage of decades. 8,000 was not a number she could get to, not from 2 jobs paying $7 an hour, not in any amount of time that felt real and immediate, not before the pipes needed to be usable, which was already, which was now. She thanked him. She walked him to the door. She came back to the kitchen and she sat down at the small table they'd bought at the Goodwill on Hadley Avenue for $14, and she put her face in her hands and she cried. Not for long. She had learned to cry efficiently the way you learn to do everything when time was scarce. 20 minutes, maybe 25. She let it go all the way, and she didn't try to manage it or shorten it or protect herself from it, because you couldn't protect yourself from it, and trying only made it take longer. The thing about crying efficiently was that it was not a contradiction. It was the acknowledgement that grief was real and necessary, and also that you had things to do afterward, and the things did not care that you had been crying. The things just waited. The list just waited. Then she wiped her face with a dish towel. She got out her legal pad. She wrote at the top, "What I can do today." Chabanda what am. She called a YouTube channel she'd found 3 weeks earlier that specialized in residential repairs for people who had no money and no choice, and she started watching videos. She learned to patch drywall. She learned to replace a toilet flapper. She learned to tape and mud and paint and caulk, and what grade of sandpaper to use on what surface, and how to read a circuit breaker, and what the difference between a load-bearing wall and a partition wall was. She watched the videos after the girls went to bed. She watched them during her breaks at Dunleavy's on her phone with the screen brightness turned all the way down. She watched them in the car before the cleaning shift and in the parking lot after. She watched them until the patterns of each task became familiar enough that she could see the steps without the video, could walk through them in her head in the dark and know what came next. She got 2 rooms of the electrical working. She sourced a second-hand hot water heater at the salvage yard on Route 9 for $50. She came back and told Boone, who said, "I'll install it for home-cooked meals." She had agreed to 1 month of dinners, and he had come back the following Saturday, and in 4 hours there was hot water. Hot water. She stood in the bathroom with her hands under the running faucet and felt the warmth and thought, this is something. This is one thing at a time. You do not need to see the whole staircase. You only need to see the next step. You take the step you can see, and then you can see the next one. The girls helped after school. Nadia pulled nails from old floorboards with a methodical patience that was almost meditative, working along the length of a board until every nail was out and the board could be lifted cleanly. Tilly sorted hardware by size and type into repurposed glass jars and labeled each one with a black marker and put them in order on the workshop shelf, building a system with the same quiet satisfaction she put into everything she organized. Rosie mostly supervised. She had appointed herself the official quality control inspector and would walk through each room after work was done and pronounce judgment. "This is good," she would say, in the serious voice she used for things she considered official. Or, "This needs more paint." She was always right about the paint. 3 weeks. 3 weeks of this and the house looked different. Not fixed, but different. There was warmth in 2 rooms and light in 3, and the kitchen sink worked, and the first floor bathroom worked, and the stairs had been checked for structural integrity, and the 3 that weren't were flagged with red painter's tape so nobody stepped wrong. 3 weeks. And Celia had learned in those 3 weeks that she was more capable than she'd thought. Not in any dramatic way, just in the quiet accumulation of things she could do now that she hadn't known she could do 3 weeks ago. The list of what she could do today was longer than it had been. The house was evidence of this. She could see the evidence every morning when she woke up. This was the work. This was how things got done. And then came the smell. It had been there from the first day, she understood later. Not strong enough to identify, just present, a layer underneath the smell of old wood and dust, and the particular quality of air that had been sealed away from movement for a long time. She'd noted it the way you noted any ambient smell filed. It didn't prioritize it. She'd had bigger problems. She'd had a list. In week 3, it became impossible to ignore. Tilly noticed first. They were eating dinner at the kitchen table, the pasta with the jarred sauce that Rosie had decided was her favorite dinner, and had therefore become the most frequent dinner. And Tilly paused with her fork halfway to her mouth and said, "What is that smell?" Celia said. "What smell?" Tilly said. Like something. Like something organic. Rosie said, like a dead raccoon. Nadia said, "It's coming from the basement." She said it the way she said everything, plainly, without alarm, as information to be noted and acted upon. She had probably been noting it for days. She had probably filed it under things Mom will address when she gets to it, which was a file Nadia maintained with remarkable organization. She was right. Celia stood at the basement door after dinner and opened it, and the smell came up the stairs like a presence heavier than it had been layered, unmistakable to someone who had worked in medicine for 6 years. Not just rot, not just an animal, something more complex, something that the clinical part of her brain began parsing before the rest of her caught up. The clinical part of her had been trained to receive information and categorize it and respond appropriately, and it was receiving information right now that the rest of her was not entirely ready for. She closed the door. She stood in the kitchen for a moment. She was a nurse. She had dealt with things that other people couldn't deal with because they didn't have the training, and she did. She had learned to put the clinical part of herself in front and let it lead and let everything else follow when the clinical part was done. She put the clinical part in front. She got the flashlight from the drawer. She got the dust mask from the supply kit in the bathroom cabinet. She got the crowbar she'd bought at the yard sale on Preston Street because she hadn't known when she'd need it, but she'd known she would. Whoever sold old houses for $1 was selling houses that had things in them that required crowbars eventually. She told Nadia to keep the girls upstairs. Nadia said, "What's down there?" She said, "I don't know yet." Nadia looked at her. In that 3-second assessment, that meant she was deciding something, taking in data and running it through whatever process she used and arriving at a conclusion. She said, "Okay," not dismissal, acknowledgement. "I've heard you, and I'll do what you're asking, and I'll wait for the information when you have it." Celia went down. The stairs were wooden, and the third one creaked, and the seventh one creaked. And then she was at the bottom, and the dirt floor was soft under her boots, and the stone walls were thick and old, original to the house's construction in the 1890s, and the water stains went halfway up every wall from the flooding Frank had mentioned. The basement smelled of minerals and old moisture, and the particular underground cold that had nothing to do with the weather outside. She turned in a slow circle with the flashlight. The basement ran the full length of the house, longer than she'd expected. The ceiling was low, maybe 6.5 feet, and the stone arch of it had the look of something built by people who understood that what went above needed serious support. The stones were well fitted. Whoever had built this foundation had known what they were doing. She followed the smell. It was strongest in the far corner, the far left corner, the farthest point from the stairs. She moved toward it with the careful steps of someone who understood that what she might find here was going to require her to be composed, and composure was a thing you chose before you needed it, not during. She got there. She put the flashlight on the wall. The stones were the same as the rest of the basement, same type, same size, same general color. But the mortar between them was different. The rest of the basement showed over 100 years of age, and water and settling dark mortar packed tight crumbled at the edges in places where the decades had worked on it. This section, maybe 6 feet wide, maybe 7 feet tall, the mortar was lighter, cleaner. The kind of mortar that had been applied 25 to 30 years ago, not 130. She ran her fingers along the lines. This section had been repointed, deliberately. Someone had taken out the old mortar and put in new mortar, and the only reason you did that to one specific section of a basement wall was if something had changed behind it. If the wall had been opened and closed again. If something had been added to the space behind it that you wanted to contain. The smell was coming from behind it. She positioned the crowbar. The first stone came out with less resistance than she expected, almost as if it had been placed without much mortar at all, as if the mortar was cosmetic rather than structural, appearance rather than function, which meant that whoever had done this had not expected it to hold against serious force, which meant that whoever had done this had expected the mortar to be sufficient because no one would be pressing against it from the outside, because no one would know to look. The smell rushed out. She stepped back. She waited. Then she stepped forward and put the flashlight through the gap. What she saw did not make immediate sense. She processed it the way she processed anything her brain wasn't prepared for, slowly, piece by piece, building from the particular to the general the way she'd been trained. Start with what you can identify. Don't skip ahead to conclusions. Let the picture build. A room, small, carved or dug out from the bedrock, 6 feet wide and 8 feet deep. The floor was stone, and filling the room stacked floor to ceiling, arranged with the methodical care of someone who had worked carefully and deliberately metal containers. Military style. Green, the olive green of ammunition boxes from old war films, with latch closures and handles. Some were stacked neatly. Others had tipped over, whether from the passage of decades or the settling of the room, she couldn't tell. Several had broken open. The contents of the broken ones were on the floor. She knew what she was looking at. She had handled enough during nursing to understand what things were made of at a sensory level, and this was unmistakable raw gold. Not jewelry, not coins, not the refined, smooth gold of anything she'd encountered before. Raw gold in the way it came out of the ground in nuggets and bars and pieces, in fine dust scattered across the stone floor of a hidden room, like someone had dropped a bucket of it and never come back to clean up. The gold caught her flashlight and threw it back, and the effect in the small stone room was extraordinary, this dim blaze of light from every surface, that the gold-touched light that had been in the dark for years, suddenly given something to reflect. She counted the intact containers with the flashlight. 37. She stood there for a moment. She stood there for what might have been 2 minutes or 5 minutes or 10, the flashlight moving slowly over the stacked containers and the spilled gold on the floor and the low stone ceiling and the walls. Then the flashlight found the corner, the far right corner of the room. There was something there that was not a container. There was something there that had been a person. She made herself look. She was a nurse. She had looked at harder things than this. She had been in rooms where death was present and had needed to function in those rooms with clarity and care. And she had done it, and she could do it now. She made herself look, and she took in what was there with the same clinical inventory she had used on 1,000 patient assessments. Partial remains, canvas rotted to remnants. Fabric disintegrated, the particular arrangement of what was left, that told a story about the original position. The person had been against the wall. The person had not been standing. And the thing that her eyes found last, because it was corroded and dark and low to the ground, 2 manacles, handcuffs heavy, the old kind, clamped around what had been 2 wrists, still locked. The metal had gone to deep rust, but the mechanism was intact, still fastened, still closed, still locked after all these years, still locked. She stood in the gap she'd made in the wall, and she looked at those handcuffs, and something happened in her that was not clinical and was not processing and was not the professional composure she'd constructed at the top of the stairs. Something broke through that, something that had nothing to do with training and everything to do with understanding. This person had been put here. This person had known what was happening. This person had not been able to stop it. She pulled herself back from that. She had to pull herself back from it because the only useful thing she could do right now was not fall apart. And she was not going to fall apart. She was going to go upstairs and she was going to sit at the kitchen table and she was going to think clearly about what she had found and what it meant and what came next. She replaced the stone. As best she could with her hands, she replaced the stone and pressed the mortar back into the gap and stepped back to look. It was not invisible, but it would hold for tonight. It would hold until she knew what she was doing. She climbed the stairs. She closed the door. She went to the kitchen table and she sat down and she held her hands out in front of her and looked at them the way she always did. The assessment, the inventory. They were shaking. Not dramatically, just slightly. The fine tremor of hands that had spent the last 15 minutes doing something the rest of her was still catching up to. She made coffee she couldn't taste with the hot water heater Boone had installed, and the coffee maker she'd found at the thrift store for $6, and she sat in the kitchen of the house she owned for $1 and she did the arithmetic. 37 containers, at least half intact. The broken ones had spilled enough gold to suggest the intact ones were full. She did not know the exact value. She could not calculate it without knowing the weight of each container. But she understood sitting at that kitchen table in the dark that the number was very large. That the number was not the kind of number that had existed in her life before. That the number was the kind of number that changed things, that changed everything, that turned the floor. She'd been trying to stand on into a completely different kind of floor. And she understood with the part of her that was still a nurse and still a person who had made promises she believed in, that there were handcuffs on what remained of a person in that room. Those handcuffs meant someone had been put there. Those handcuffs meant someone had been looking for that person for a long time. Those handcuffs meant that the gold in those 37 containers had a history that was not just financial. Upstairs, Rosie's breathing steady and trusting. Tilly's silence that meant sleep. Nadia's silence that meant not sleep, that meant listening, that meant waiting for information. Celia wrapped both hands around her coffee mug. Tomorrow she would begin to understand the shape of what she'd found. Tonight she made herself memorize the face of the choice that was already forming, the one that didn't have clean edges, the one that lived in the space between what you needed and what was right. She made herself look at it directly. You did not solve hard problems by looking away from them. You looked at them, you held them, and then you decided what kind of person you were going to be. She sat at the kitchen table until the coffee went cold, and the candle burned down, and the house was fully dark and fully quiet. And she thought about her nurse's hands, the hands that had spent 6 years knowing the difference between things that could be saved and things that couldn't. The hands that were shaking and were tired and were hers. Outside October. The slow sound of Riverton going about the business of a Tuesday night, indifferent and ongoing, the city doing what cities did, while the people inside the houses did what people did. Inside a house with a foundation that held. She did not tell anyone. This was the first decision, and it was not a difficult one, which was itself a kind of information. She had expected to agonize over it. She had expected the weight of the decision to feel like something she would have to drag with her. Instead, it settled quietly the way decisions settled when you had already been moving toward them before you consciously recognized what they were. She did not tell Boone. She did not tell Frank Aldridge. She told her daughters that the smell in the basement was a drainage problem and that she was handling it, which was technically true, and was also the most incomplete sentence she had ever spoken in their presence. She watched Nadia receive this and file it in whatever category Nadia kept for information she suspected was partial, the category she was apparently too observant not to have. She spent 2 days doing nothing except working her shifts and feeding her children and thinking. She thought carefully. She thought about the 2 things she now knew were in that room: gold and a person. She thought about what each of them meant separately and what they meant together. She thought about what she had and what she needed and what the gap between those 2 things required of her. On the 3rd day, she drove to the coin shop. Not the one on Aldine Street, 4 blocks from Dunleavy's, which was too close to her daily routine. Not the one in the Riverton Mall, which had security cameras and the particular attentiveness of a business that had been robbed before. She drove to Harwick, 40 miles north, to a shop on a commercial strip between a dry cleaner and a cell phone repair place, the kind of shop that had been in the same location for 20 years and had the look of a business that had learned to mind its own concerns. She had one piece in her jacket pocket. She'd selected it carefully from the floor of the hidden room, small enough to be credibly from an old jewelry collection, irregular enough to be clearly handmade rather than processed heavy, in the way that raw gold was heavy, which was different from the weight of anything else. The weight of gold was particular. It had a density that made you recalibrate your estimate every time. She had a story ready. She had been a nurse. Nurses told people things that were hard to hear, and they did it with steady eyes and a clear voice. And they meant every word they said, even when what they said was a partial version of a larger truth. She was not going to have any trouble with the story. She went in. She asked the man behind the counter if he bought estate gold. He said he did. She put the piece on the glass counter and said her grandmother had left a collection of things and she was still going through it, and she wanted to understand what she was dealing with before she made any decisions. The man was thin, with thick glasses and the deliberate movements of someone who had developed habits of precision over decades. He picked up the piece. He turned it. He examined it under a loupe. He took it to a back counter and ran a series of tests she watched from across the glass without being able to see clearly. When he came back, his manner had shifted. Not dramatically, just a recalibration, the small adjustments of someone updating an assessment. He said, "This is raw gold, not jewelry gold, not processed, raw." She said, "I know. My grandmother was a collector." He said, "High purity, very high purity." He set it on a small digital scale. He looked at the number. He said, "This piece is worth approximately $800 at current market." $800. She received this without expression. She had trained herself in the past 3 days to receive information about the gold without expression, the same way she had trained herself in nursing school to receive information about a patient's condition without expression, because expression was a communication, and she was not yet prepared to communicate. $800 for a piece she could cover with 2 fingers. She thought about the 37 containers. She thought about the floor of the room covered in spilled gold. She said, "I have more pieces, various sizes. Would you be interested in purchasing them?" He looked at her. He said, "I'd need to see them, and I'd need documentation of origin for anything significant." She thanked him and left with the piece still in her pocket. She drove back to Riverton. She did not stop at the coffee shop. She went straight home, let herself in, stood in the kitchen. Outside, the girls were at school. Boone was not coming today. Frank was in his house. She went down to the basement. She removed enough stones to get through, and she went into the room with her flashlight, and she stood in the middle of it, and she looked at what was there. The containers, the spilled gold, the corner she did not look at directly. She counted what she could calculate. The broken containers had spilled enough to cover approximately 12 square feet of floor at a rough depth of 2 inches. The intact containers, based on weight estimates from the one-sheet handle, suggested each held between 30 and 50 pounds. At $800 for a piece she could cover with 2 fingers. The volume in front of her represented a number she could not fully hold in her head all at once. She made herself think about it anyway. She made herself think about it all the way to the end, because the only way to make a real decision was to know exactly what you were deciding about. Then she made her system. Every 6 to 8 weeks, a different dealer. Never the same shop twice. Never closer than 40 miles. Always a different story, inherited jewelry, estate sale, family collection. Always one piece, sometimes 2 if they were small. Never enough to trigger reporting requirements, never enough to be memorable. She mapped it out on a sheet of paper and pencil. Shops within a 100-mile radius. She had 12 identified before she started, which meant 12 visits before she would need to expand her range, which bought her a year and a half of careful distance. She made the list and she looked at it. She did not feel the way she had expected to feel. She felt like someone who had found a way to stop drowning. And she understood that this was not a pure feeling, that it was contaminated, that the way to stop drowning she had found involved things she was not going to let herself look at fully tonight. She would look at them, Just not yet. The first visit paid for a month of groceries and the materials for the roof patch on the east side. She did the patch herself with a YouTube tutorial and 3 trips up the ladder in the specific focused patience of someone who understood that a small job done correctly was better than a large job done approximately. The second visit paid for the replacement window frames on the first floor. She and Nadia installed them on a Saturday with Nadia holding the frames while Celia did the fastening and Tilly reading the instructions from her phone because the instructions mattered and someone needed to track them. The third visit covered the cost of Nadia's school trip to Hartford that she'd been telling Nadia they couldn't afford, and then found herself writing the check for without telling Nadia where the money had come from, which was a particular kind of discomfort, she noted, and set aside. The house changed. Room by room, it changed. Celia worked on it in the afternoons between the morning coffee shift and the evening cleaning shift, learning as she went, making mistakes and fixing them. YouTube and determination and the specific problem-solving intelligence of someone who had spent years in emergency medicine, where you worked with what you had and you did not stop to wish for better tools. You worked with what you had, you solved the problem in front of you, you moved to the next problem. The girl's bedroom came together first. She found a second-hand dresser at the thrift store and sanded it and painted it the blue-green color Tilly had been drawing on her dream house roofs for 6 months. She built shelves for Nadia's books from lumber scraps in a YouTube tutorial, and they were not perfectly level, but Nadia put her books on them without comment, and that was enough. Nadia never wasted praise, but she also never ignored things that deserved it. The books went on the shelves stayed. That was acknowledgement. She quit the office cleaning job in November. She worked out the math, 1 job more hours at the coffee shop, and the careful management of the additional income from the gold she was converting. She went down to 40 hours at Dunleavy's and used the evenings for the house and her daughters and the online nursing recertification courses she had enrolled in because she was going to need a legitimate explanation for their improving circumstances eventually, and also because she wanted to go back to nursing, and it was time to start moving toward that again. This was how the fall went. And underneath it, like the sound you heard in a building before you could identify the source, was the thing she had not done yet. She went to the Riverton Public Library on a Wednesday morning when the girls were at school. She told the librarian she was researching local property history. The librarian was not suspicious. Nobody was suspicious of a woman in the local history section, which was always underpopulated and smelled like documents that had been important once and were now being preserved mostly on principle. She started with the city records. Harold Keene had owned 1247 Maple Street from 1971 until his death in 1995. Before Harold, it had been owned by a family named Prescott for 30 years, and before that, another family, and the house went back to 1891 without interruption, which was consistent with its construction. His daughter Ivy had inherited it and had lived there until her health declined in the late 2000s, and the house had been vacant and accumulating back taxes since then. This was all public record and told her nothing she didn't already know. She requested the newspaper archives from 1987. The librarian brought them on a cart. Celia started in January and worked forward through the microfilm with the methodical attention of someone who had been doing careful reading for hours and had not found what she was looking for yet and was prepared to continue until she did. She found it in the September issues. The headline was not small. It had been a significant crime for the region: gold transport robbery on Interstate 84. $50 million in raw gold missing. Security guard presumed dead. She read the article the way she read medical literature, for facts rather than narrative. Facts were what she needed. Narrative could come later. The Cascade Mining Corporation had been transporting raw gold from their processing facility in western Connecticut to a federal depository in New York. The transport truck had been intercepted on I-84 in the early morning hours of September 14, 1987. The gold, approximately 190 pounds, had been taken. The security guard assigned to the transport, a man named Victor Shaw, had not been found. Victor Shaw was 27 years old. He had a wife and a 2-year-old daughter. Celia stopped on that sentence. She read it again. A wife and a 2-year-old daughter. He had been 27 years old with a wife and a 2-year-old daughter, and he had gone to work one morning and he had not come home, and his wife had not known, and his 2-year-old daughter had not known, and the 2-year-old daughter was now, by the arithmetic, approximately the age Celia was now. She continued. The investigation identified several persons of interest, including employees of the transport company. One name appeared 3 times in 3 different articles across the fall of 1987. Harold Keene, an employee who had called in sick on the day of the robbery. FBI agents had interviewed him twice. He had no previous record. He had submitted to interviews voluntarily. He had provided an alibi for the morning in question. The case had gone cold by 1989. Harold Keene had retired from his job in early 1988. He had paid off his mortgage in cash in March of 1988. He had purchased a new truck in April of 1988. His neighbors quoted in a follow-up article from 1990 described him as having changed significantly after 1987. Withdrawn, paranoid, drank more than he used to, didn't socialize the way he once had. There was a photograph. It was a group photo from a company picnic in 1986, the year before the robbery. Harold Keene was in the second row, third from the left. He was heavy-set with the careful stillness of someone who was aware of the camera and had decided how he wanted to appear in it. He had the eyes of a man who was calculating something. Victor Shaw was in the front row. He was young, genuinely young, the kind of young you only fully understood from the distance of having left it behind. He was smiling with the ease of someone who had not yet done the arithmetic on how much could go wrong. The ease of a young man who believed his life was going to go approximately the way he expected it to go. Because the morning he stood in the front row and smiled at the camera, there was no evidence otherwise. Celia looked at the photograph for a long time. She was sitting in the local history section of the Riverton Public Library, and she was looking at a photograph of a man who had been 27 years old and had a 2-year-old daughter and had gone out to do his job one morning in September and had not come home. And she knew with the certainty of someone who had been in a basement with handcuffed remains that he had never been found. His wife had not known. His daughter had grown up not knowing. She thought about that daughter. She thought about a 2-year-old who was now, by the math, approximately the same age Celia was now. She thought about growing up with a question where a father should have been. She thought about the particular shape of that absence, the question that had no answer, the space that stayed open because there was nothing to close it. She closed the newspapers. She drove home. She sat at the kitchen table after the girls went to bed, and she took out her legal pad. She did not write on it for a long time. She just sat with it in front of her, and she thought about Victor Shaw's daughter, and she thought about Nadia and Tilly and Rosie, and she thought about what it meant to need something and what it meant to do harm in order to get it. She thought about the difference between the two things. She thought about whether the difference was always clear and decided it was not always clear, but that this time it was. She thought about what the nurse's version of herself would say, and she knew exactly what that version would say. Then she wrote a letter. She did not write it at home. She drove to the public library the next morning before it opened and waited for the computer terminals, and when they opened, she sat at a terminal in the far corner and she typed. She composed it carefully, choosing words the way she chose anything for their accuracy and their usefulness. She told them about the basement. She told them about the hidden room. She told them about the handcuffs. She gave them the address, the room, the location, everything precise enough to act on. She was specific about the mortar, about the placement, about the exact corner because she understood that police and federal agencies needed to be told things precisely if you wanted them to act on them efficiently. She did not mention the gold. She printed the letter at the library printer and paid the 10 cents per page and folded it into an envelope she had brought from home. She addressed it to the FBI field office in Hartford. She mailed it from a post office 2 towns over. Then she drove home. She did not feel better. She had expected to feel better, and she did not. She felt as though she had done one portion of a thing that needed doing and had not done another portion, and the incomplete portion was heavier than the done portion. This was accurate. The incomplete portion was heavier. The incomplete portion was always going to be heavier. She went back to work. She worked the morning shift at Dunleavy's and she made coffee and she listened to customers talk about their days. And she smiled at the right moments and said the right things. And the whole time, the incomplete portion sat in her chest with a weight she could feel precisely because it was new. Before she found the room, she had been carrying poverty and exhaustion and the accumulated weight of things not working. She knew what those felt like. She knew how to carry them. This felt different. 3 weeks later, the black vehicles arrived. She saw them from the kitchen window. Two dark sedans, the particular unmarked quality of government vehicles that were trying not to announce themselves, and were doing so by looking exactly like government vehicles that were trying not to announce themselves. A woman got out of the first car, 40 perhaps, dark hair compact with the specific economy of movement that people develop when they'd spent years learning not to waste it. She moved across the yard with the attention of someone cataloging the space as she crossed it. A man from the second car, taller, precise in his manner, with the bearing of someone who understood institutional authority from the inside. Celia went to the door before they knocked. She said, "Can I help you?" The woman said, "Agent Sorrell, FBI. This is Agent Pike, Treasury Department. We received some information about this property. We'd like to ask you a few questions and take a look at the basement if that's all right with you." Celia said, "Of course. Come in." She made coffee she did not drink, and she stood in the kitchen while they went through the house with the methodical attention of professionals who had done this before. She watched Sorrell without appearing to watch her. The agent moved through each room with the assessing eye of someone building a picture, not searching for a specific thing, but learning the geography, understanding the space, noting what had been done to the house, what had been improved, what the improvements suggested about the person who had made them. They found the resealed wall section in 11 minutes. Sorrell crouched beside it. She ran her finger along the mortar line. She did not look at Celia. She said to Pike, "Recent repair." Pike said, "Consistent with the tip." They removed the stones with more care than Celia had, properly with the patience of people who were building evidence rather than satisfying curiosity. When the gap was large enough, Sorrell put a flashlight through. A long silence. Pike said, "There." Sorrell said, "I see it. They photographed everything before they touched anything." Celia stood at the base of the stairs and watched the flashlight beams move through the gap, and she kept her face arranged in the expression she had decided on. Concern, confusion, cooperation, the face of a homeowner who had bought a house for $1 and discovered it had a darker history than anyone had told her. She had rehearsed this face. She had sat in the bathroom at Dunleavy's between the morning and afternoon rushes and looked at herself in the mirror and practiced it. Not because she was a practiced liar, but because she was a nurse who had learned that your face was a communication and you controlled your communications. They were in the basement for 40 minutes. When they came back up, Sorrell said, "We're going to need to bring in a forensic team. You'll need to stay elsewhere for a few days while we process the scene. Do you have somewhere you can go?" Celia said, "I can arrange something." Sorrell said, "The remains we found. We believe they may be connected to a decades-old case. The original owner of this property was a person of interest. He died in 1995, so we can't prosecute. But we'd like to identify the remains and give the family closure." Celia said, "Of course, whatever you need." Sorrell's eyes held on her for a moment. The moment was long enough to be noticed, not hostile, assessing. The look of someone who was very good at what they did, taking in information. Then one other thing. The case involved a significant theft of raw gold, nearly 200 pounds. It was never recovered. She let that sentence sit in the kitchen like a physical object. She said, "You didn't find it." Sorrell said, "Strange, isn't it? Man hides a body but not the gold." She said it without accusation, without inflection. The simple observation of someone who had spent decades learning that the gap between what people said and what they knew was the most useful space in any investigation. She was not accusing Celia. She was placing the gap in the room and letting it sit there. Celia said, "I wouldn't know anything about that. I bought this house because it was $1 and I needed a place for my children. Sorrel looked at her. She said, I believe that. She handed Celia a card, called it done for the day. They walked back to their vehicles with the unhurried pace of people who had more time than you thought. At the car, Sorrel turned. She looked at the house. She looked for 3 full seconds. Her expression was unreadable. Then she got in the car. Celia went back to the kitchen. She sat down. She did not move for approximately 5 minutes. Then she picked up the phone and called Frank Aldridge and asked if the girls could stay with him for a few days while the authorities worked on some things at the house. Frank said, of course. He came over that afternoon and helped her carry the sleeping bags next door, and Rosie immediately began explaining to him the geography of their camping trip in great detail. And he listened with the patient attention of a man who had raised children 30 years ago, and remembered that they needed to be heard, that the act of listening to them was not incidental, but foundational. While the girls were occupied, Frank said they were asking about the house. Celia said, they found something in the basement, something old, related to the previous owner. Frank said Harold. He said it the way you said the name of someone you had spent a long time forming an opinion about. The name with all its history compressed into one syllable. She said, you knew him well. Frank said, well enough. We were neighbors for 20 years. He moved here in 71, I moved in 73. We used to have a beer on the porch in summer the way you did back then. He was a reasonable man before. Then something happened around 87 and he changed. She said, changed how? Frank said, came into money. Not a lot, not obviously, but enough. Paid off the house, bought a new truck. That was notable because Harold had always talked about money with a specific concern of someone who didn't have quite enough. Then suddenly he had enough, and it didn't seem to make him happy, which you'd think it would, which it usually does. He looked out at the backyard. At the November trees, bare now, the yard Celia had been slowly clearing on weekends. He said, he started drinking, not badly at first, but consistently. Stopped having people over. If you knocked on his door, he'd answer, but he'd stand in the doorway the whole time, not invite you in. The curtains were always closed, front and back, all day. She said, did anyone ask him about it? Frank said people noticed. But you didn't ask Harold things directly. He had the kind of face that said, don't push. He was still friendly on the surface, still waved when you drove past. But there was something watching behind his eyes all the time, like he was waiting for something to arrive that he knew was coming. He paused. He said his daughter Ivy said when she found him after the heart attack, his eyes were open. She said he looked afraid, not surprised, afraid. Like whatever he'd been waiting for, he could finally see it clearly. He said this without drama, just as memory, the way old men carried things intact, specific without the emotion having worn off, but also without the emotion being performed. It had happened. It was true. He was telling her because she had asked. Celia said, that's a hard thing to carry. Frank said Ivy carried it her whole life, the house and all its history. She was a quiet woman, never married, never explained herself to anyone. Kept the place going as best she could. When she got sick, it got to be too much. She died 2 years ago. He looked at the house. He said she used to say she felt watched in that house. I always thought she meant Harold, his presence, the way certain places hold on to the people who lived in them too intensely. Now I wonder if she meant something else. Celia said nothing. She sat with Frank's words and thought about Ivy Keene, who had lived in her father's house with her father's secret and had never married and had felt watched and had died 2 years ago without telling anyone what she suspected, if she had suspected, about whether Ivy had known, about whether knowing or not knowing was easier to carry. She thought that sometimes you couldn't tell. The FBI was in the house for 4 days. She and the girls stayed at Frank's. He had a spare room and a pull-out sofa and 40 years of accumulated paperback westerns that Tilly discovered on the second afternoon and worked through with focused intensity. Rosie decided he was the best person she had ever met because he let her help water his plants and explained each one to her with the patience of someone who understood that children were not a disturbance, but a different kind of audience. She learned the names of 7 plants in 4 days. She called them her friends. Nadia watched. She watched the way she always watched, from a slight remove, absorbing. She watched the FBI vehicles come and go. She watched Celia check her phone. She watched the expression on Celia's face when she thought no one was looking. The expression on Celia's face when she thought no one was looking was apparently a different expression from the one she wore when she thought someone was looking, and Nadia, who watched faces the way other people watch the weather, had cataloged both and was comparing them. On the second night at Frank's, after Tilly and Rosie were asleep, Nadia came into the small sitting room where Celia was reading. She sat on the other end of the sofa. She said, "You knew what was down there." Celia looked up. She said, "The authorities are handling it." Nadia said, "That's not what I asked." A pause. Celia said, "I found something in the basement that I reported to the FBI." Yes, I knew something was there. Nadia looked at her with the flat measuring quality of someone who was deciding how much they believed. She said, "Is that all?" Celia held her daughter's gaze. She said, "That's all I can tell you right now." Nadia held the silence for another moment. Her grandmother's eyes, the particular quality of looking that went all the way through a thing and came out the other side. Then she nodded. She went back to bed. They returned to the house on the 5th day. The basement had been processed. The wall had been resealed with professional mortar cleaner, than what she'd done the work of people who did this precisely and without hurry. The house felt different in the way houses felt different after something had been taken from them, lighter and also emptier. Agent Sorrell called her that afternoon. She said the remains have been preliminarily identified as Victor Shaw, the security guard who disappeared in connection with the 1987 Cascade mining theft. His family will be notified. The previous owner of the property, Harold Keene, is believed to have been responsible. He's deceased, so there's no prosecution. But at least the family will have answers. Celia said, "I'm glad." Sorrell said, "Mrs. Morse, one more time. The gold from the theft was never recovered. If you found anything in that house that you haven't disclosed, the statute of limitations doesn't apply to stolen property. Possession is its own issue." Celia said, "I understand." Sorrell said, "Just making sure." The line went quiet and then went dead. Celia set the phone on the counter. She stood in the kitchen in the house she owned for $1 in the room she had repainted herself and hung the second-hand curtains she'd sewn to fit. And she thought about the storage unit in Mill Haven, 30 miles east, rented under the name of a shell company she'd created with $40 and a printer and careful reading of 2 legal forms at 2 in the morning in the weeks when she hadn't been sleeping well and had been using the time to prepare for contingencies. She thought about the containers in that storage unit. She thought about Sorrell's voice. Not threatening, informational. The voice of someone who was leaving a door open and was watching to see if it would be used. She thought about the photograph in the newspaper from 1986. Victor Shaw, young and unworried, smiling in the front row. She went back to work. November came. The house was warm by November. She had gotten the furnace working with Boone's help, and it ran loudly, but it ran, and there was something about warmth after the months in the car, in the early weeks in the cold house, that she did not think she would ever take for granted again. The warmth was something she noticed every time she came in from outside. She noticed it actively, deliberately, the way you notice things you had once lost. Tilly drew on the windows when they fogged. Small houses as always, but now she added the real house behind her drawings, the outline of the Maple Street house, the porch, the roof line she'd been sketching since before they ever walked up to it. Rosie brought her stuffed animals one by one from the Explorer, where they'd been in a bag since September, and installed them on her bedroom shelf in an order that was apparently deliberate and important, and which she explained to Celia at length. Each animal had a location that made sense for reasons Rosie understood completely, and which she communicated with the certainty of someone operating from a system. Nadia did homework at the kitchen table every evening. Celia watched her daughter's face in the lamplight, and she thought about how much Nadia had carried and kept carrying, and never put down how the caring had become so habitual that she probably no longer distinguished between what was hers and what had been handed to her when she wasn't looking. She thought I did that. I handed her things she shouldn't be carrying, and then she thought, I'm still doing it. She did not stop. She told herself she would stop soon. She told herself she was being careful. She told herself that what she was doing was temporary and the result was permanent, and the permanent result would outweigh the temporary doing. She told herself this every time she drove to a new shop in a new town with a new piece from the broken containers, and every time the math added up, she told herself again, because the math was clean and the math was persuasive, and the math was easier to look at than some of the other things. The other things were not as clean. The other things required a different kind of looking. The house changes continued. She repainted the kitchen in a warm yellow that Rosie had chosen from a paint chip fan with the seriousness of someone making a consequential decision, which she was. She fixed the second floor bathroom, the one that had needed everything, by working on it every evening for 2 weeks. She rebuilt the back porch steps with lumber and a YouTube tutorial on stair stringers that she had watched 4 times before she touched a single board. She did the work. The work accumulated. The house was more than livable now. The house was in the specific way that places became themselves through the attention paid to them becoming home. On a Thursday evening in the second week of November, she came home from Dunleavy's and found a drawing on the kitchen table. Tilly had left her drawings around the house for months. It was how she processed things. She drew them. She drew the house in various stages of repair. She drew the street in October and November. She drew Frank's garden. She drew family portraits with the visual shorthand she developed, each person recognizable from 2 or 3 defining marks. This drawing was a family portrait. Celia in the center, as always. Nadia to the left. Tilly and Rosie to the right. The house behind them the way it looked now, with the painted trim and the fixed porch and the windows that let light in. Everyone in the drawing had a face. Eyes, nose, full expression. Tilly was smiling. Nadia had the straight-line mouth she always drew for Nadia. Rosie had the widest smile of all of them, except Celia. Celia's face in the drawing had eyes, had a nose, had everything that made the face a face. But where the mouth should be blank, smooth paper, no mark. Celia held the drawing. She turned it. She looked at it from different angles as if this might change what she saw. When Tilly came in from the backyard, her boots still muddy, Celia said, "Did you mean to leave this mouth out?" Tilly looked at the drawing. She considered it with the equanimity of someone reviewing work they'd completed consciously. She said, "I didn't know what to draw." Celia said, "What do you mean?" Tilly said, "Your mouth is different now than it used to be. Before, when you smiled, your whole face smiled. Now your face smiles and your mouth smiles, but they're not doing the same thing." She said it without criticism, as observation, as the factual report of a 10-year-old who drew faces the way some people read them, as the most honest thing a person showed, the most unguarded, the most revealing. She drew faces because faces told her things, and Celia's face was telling her something she didn't know how to render in colored pencil. Celia said, "I see." Tilly said, "So I left it blank because I didn't want to draw the wrong thing." She pulled off her muddy boots and went upstairs. Celia sat with the drawing for a long time. She thought, "I am becoming Harold Keene." She thought not the violence, not what he did, but the watching behind the eyes, the waiting for something to arrive, the closed curtains of the self, the smile that wasn't doing the same thing as the rest of the face. Harold Keene's neighbors had described him as friendly on the surface, but something watching behind his eyes. And here was her 10-year-old who drew faces as her primary way of understanding the world, telling her she had developed the same quality. She thought, "My 10-year-old can see it." She put the drawing in the kitchen drawer. She went upstairs and she helped Rosie with her reading, and she talked to Nadia about the debate topic she was preparing, and she sat on the edge of Tilly's bed and she said, "I'm going to figure things out. I promise." Tilly said, "I know." She said it simply, without the weight of doubt. The way you said things to people you trusted to eventually be who you needed them to be. Not as reassurance, as fact. Celia sat with that for a moment. The letter arrived on a Thursday. No return address. Plain white envelope. Her name and address in printed letters, the generic kind from a printer. Nothing distinctive about the font or the paper. Inside a single photocopy of a newspaper article from 1987. The gold theft. Victor Shaw's disappearance. The headline in the bold font of something that had been significant news. And below it in the same printed font, a single line, I know what you found. No signature, no demand, no instruction, no indication of what they wanted or what they intended to do with what they knew. Just a statement. She burned it in the kitchen sink, running the water over the ash until nothing remained. She stood at the sink afterward, with her hands under the water, and she made herself think about who could have sent it. Sorrel testing her. Frank, who had watched her carry things from the basement at 2 in the morning that one time, and had seemed to accept her explanation but maybe hadn't. The coin dealer in Harwick, who had looked at that first piece with an expression she had logged but not fully analyzed. Someone she hadn't thought of, someone on the edges of the situation who had seen or heard something she didn't know they'd seen or heard. She could not know which. She could not solve for an unknown variable without more information. What she could do was move faster. She drove to Mill Haven that night after the girls were in bed. She'd told Nadia she was picking up supplies, which was not a story Nadia fully believed, and they both knew it, and the gap between what was said and what was known had expanded to the point where even Nadia's patience with it had a limit she was approaching. She took the Explorer with the false floor she'd installed in the trunk, and she moved 6 of the containers from the storage unit to a second location, a foreclosed property on Orchard Road she'd purchased quietly through the shell company, a cabin in the woods 14 miles north that she'd been paying cash for in monthly increments since October. The drive there and back took 2 hours. She was careful about speed. She was careful about route. She checked her mirrors with the regularity of someone who had become, without planning, to very good at looking behind her. She got home at 1:45 in the morning. She cut the headlights before she turned onto Maple Street. She pulled into the driveway slowly. She sat for a moment in the dark car and she breathed. In the houses on either side of the street, in all the houses she could see from the driveway, people were sleeping, living their lives in the ordinary way. She got out. She went to the side door, the one that didn't squeak, and she opened it with her key, and she stepped into the kitchen, and she turned on the under cabinet light, the small one, the one that didn't spill far. Nadia was sitting at the kitchen table. She was fully dressed. She had been fully dressed for at least an hour, maybe more, because her posture had the settled quality of waiting that was past the stage of urgency and into the stage of resolution. Her hands were on the table folded, her debate team sweatshirt, her grandmother's eyes. She was looking at the door. She had been waiting for the door. Celia stood in the doorway. She said, Nadia. Nadia said Tilly had a nightmare. She woke up and came to find you and you weren't there. And she woke me up and I had to tell her you went for a drive because you couldn't sleep. And I had to sit with her until she went back to sleep. And then I came down here. She said it without heat, without accusation. Just the sequence of events told plainly in the order they had happened. Celia came in and closed the door. She sat down at the table. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The under-cabinet light made a small, warm circle, outside the ordinary quiet of a street at 2 in the morning. Then Nadia said, You've been teaching me my whole life that what you do matters, that how you do things matters, that the reason you do something doesn't make it the right thing. Celia said, Nadia. Nadia said, I'm not finished. She said it the way Celia had said it to her years ago in the middle of conversations that needed completing. The specific phrase, the specific firmness. Return now used correctly, used with the same authority Celia had originally given it. She said, I'm not asking you to explain. I'm not asking you to justify it. I know why you did whatever it is you did. I'm not stupid, and I've lived in this house for 3 months, and I've watched us go from $87 to a fixed furnace and new windows and a school trip to Hartford, and I've done the math on your coffee shop salary, and the math doesn't work. She said, what I want to know is whether you're going to stop. Celia looked at her daughter, 12 years old, wearing the debate team sweatshirt, hands folded on the table, the look that went all the way through things. She had not asked where the money came from. She had not accused. She had asked the only question that actually mattered, and she had asked it directly because she was her grandmother's granddaughter, and she did not circle around things. Celia said, "I don't know yet." Nadia said, "That's not good enough." She said it quietly, not as a demand, as a statement of what was true. She said, "You didn't raise us to accept that from other people. I don't want to accept it from you." She got up. She said, "I'm going back to bed. Tilly is going to want you there when she wakes up. She had a nightmare about you being gone." She went upstairs. Celia sat at the kitchen table. She sat there for a long time. She did not make coffee. She did not turn on more lights. She sat in the small radius of the under-cabinet light, and she held her daughter's question the way you held something you knew was going to change shape as you held it. Are you going to stop? She thought about Tilly's drawing, the blank where the mouth should be, the 10-year-old who drew faces as her primary way of understanding the world, telling her with colored pencil in a blank space that something had gone wrong with the way she was presenting herself. She thought about Rosie, who still believed this was a camping trip, who was 7 years old and deserving of a life that was built on true things. She thought about the photograph of Victor Shaw, young and unworried, in the front row of a company picnic. She thought about Sorrel's voice on the phone leaving a door open. She thought about Harold Keene dying alone in his kitchen with his eyes open. She thought about the compass she had in nursing school, the internal one, the one her instructors had talked about when they talked about what separated a good nurse from someone who just completed procedures. The compass that pointed toward what was right for the patient, even when right was harder than the other direction. The compass that was built from training and from something prior to training, something that was already there before the training refined it. She had not lost that compass. She had just been navigating by something else. Outside Riverton at 2 in the morning. The specific quiet of a street where people were sleeping in houses they owned, heating they could control beds that would be there in the morning. Inside a house she had built into something real. She sat at the kitchen table and she held the question her 12-year-old had left her with, and she did not answer it tonight, but she held it. She held it the way you held things that needed holding. She held it and she thought about tomorrow. The call came on a Friday morning, not from the Hartford field office, not from any number she recognized. The phone buzzed while she was washing dishes, and she looked at the screen, and the number had a Hartford area code, but was not the office line, and she knew before she answered what kind of call it was going to be. She answered. Sorrel said, "I'm not calling officially. This isn't a recorded line, and this isn't part of any active investigation. I want you to understand that before we say anything else." Celia dried her hands on the dish towel. She said, "All right." Sorrel said, "I've been doing this job for 17 years. I've worked property crimes, financial crimes, theft cases going back 30 years. I know what moved assets look like. I know what careful people look like. I know the difference between someone who found something and got rid of it quickly because they panicked and someone who built a system." She paused. She said, "You built a system, Mrs. Morse." Celia said, "I don't know what you're referring to." Sorrel said, "I know you don't. And I know why you'd say that, and I'm not asking you to say anything different. I'm calling because I have looked at your file, and what I see is a woman who reported the remains when she didn't have to, who cooperated fully with our process, and who bought a condemned house for $1 because she had no other choice, and 3 children who needed somewhere to sleep." She paused again. She said, "I have 3 nephews, 8, 11, and 14. My sister works 2 jobs and their father is not a factor. I understand what your situation looked like from the outside because I've been close enough to something like it to know." Another pause. She said, "I'm not calling to threaten you. I'm calling because the file is going to stay open as long as there are unanswered questions. And unanswered questions have a way of becoming answered questions eventually, and eventually is easier to manage than suddenly." "Do you understand what I'm saying?" Celia said, "I think so." Sorrel said, "If there's something to be resolved, the time to resolve it is before it becomes something I can't give you any latitude on. That's all I'm saying, and I won't call again." The line went quiet. Celia set the phone down on the counter and stood at the kitchen sink and looked at the window above it. At the November yard, the bare trees at the property lined the sky, the specific gray of a day that had decided not to fully commit to anything. She stood there for a long time. She thought about the storage unit in Millhaven. She thought about the containers at the cabin on Orchard Road. She thought about the shell company and the accounts and the careful architecture of distance she had built between herself and what she'd taken. She thought about Nadia at the kitchen table at 2 in the morning, the folded hands, the steady eyes. "Are you going to stop?" She thought about Tilly's drawing and the blank where the mouth should be. She thought about Victor Shaw, 27 front row, smiling. She thought about Harold Keene dying alone in his kitchen with his eyes open. She turned off the faucet. She picked up her keys. Boone's shop was on the edge of the commercial district in a building that had been a garage before it was a plumbing business and had not entirely forgotten its original purpose. He worked alone, mostly taking residential calls, in some light commercial, the kind of business that ran on reputation and showing up on time and not adding costs that weren't there. It was the kind of business that suited him because he was the kind of person who suited it thorough, reliable, without the need to be more than what the job required. She found him in the back working on something with his hands in a way that suggested complete absorption. He heard her come in and looked up without surprise. He said, "Celia," she said, "I need to talk to you." He wiped his hands. He looked at her face. He had learned to read her face the way she had learned to read the house, by paying attention long enough that the patterns became legible. He pulled out the folding chair he kept against the wall and gestured to it, and she sat and he sat on the workbench with the easy balance of someone who had spent a lot of years adapting to available seating. She told him, from the beginning, the flashlight and the gap in the wall and the room and the containers and the handcuffs in the corner, the calculation at the kitchen table, the system she'd built, the library and the newspaper archives and Victor Shaw's photograph, the letter she'd sent to the FBI and the agents who had come, in the mortar she'd carefully aged, and the night she'd moved the containers to the cabin. She told him about Tilly's drawing, about Nadia at 2 in the morning. She told him all of it without stopping, the way you told things when you'd been holding them alone long enough that the telling had its own momentum, when the pressure of holding had built to the point where the release was not a choice, but a necessity. He didn't interrupt. When she was done, there was a silence that was not uncomfortable. He was the kind of man who used silence the way careful people used it, not as the absence of response, but as a considered one. He was running it through his understanding, building a complete picture, deciding what he thought. Then he said, "How much is left?" She said, "About 60% of what was originally there. I sold the rest over about 3 months." He said, "Where is the rest now?" She said, "The storage unit in the cabin." He was quiet again. He said, "The FBI agent who called this morning, she said she's given me a window. I don't know how wide it is." He said, "What do you want to do?" She looked at him. She said, "I want to know what you think I should do." He said, "I think you already know what you should do. I think you called me because you needed to say it out loud to someone who wouldn't fall apart when you said it." She said, "That's probably true." He said, "Then say it." She looked at the floor of his shop, at the tools on the wall hung in order, at the particular quality of a space organized by someone who understood that order was not just aesthetic, but functional, that knowing where everything was meant being able to do the work, that you could not do the work properly in disorder. She said, "I have to give it back." She said it quietly, the way you said things that had been forming for a long time and finally arrived at their full shape. She said, "Not because I'm afraid of getting caught, because Nadia asked me a question and I couldn't answer it, because Tilly drew my face without a mouth, because I spent 6 years telling patients and their families the truth, even when the truth was hard, and I have been unable to tell the truth to my own children for 3 months, and I am becoming someone they can't read, and I am not willing to do that." She said, Victor Shaw's daughter is approximately my age. She grew up without a father because Harold Keene put her father in a wall. I have been living on what Harold Keene put in that wall, and every time I think about it clearly, I understand that those two things are not separable. The money and the crime are not separable. I cannot keep one without the other. She said, I know what we go back to. I know what the numbers look like without it. I know that. She said it without making it a question. It was a statement. She knew the numbers. She had done the arithmetic on the numbers the same morning she'd done the arithmetic on everything else. Boone said, okay, just that. She said, okay. He said, you've made your decision. You're telling me so you have a witness. I'm the witness. Okay. She said, what if it goes wrong? What if the immunity doesn't hold? What if, he said, then I help with the girls. That's not a question you need to ask me, Celia. You shouldn't have to ask it. It's already yes. She looked at him. He said, I've been watching you fix that house since September. I watched you watch YouTube tutorials in the parking lot before your shift and then come and do exactly what you just learned without stopping for doubt. You fix things, you do it right, and you do it without making it about you. Whatever happens next, you're not doing it alone. She drove home. She sat in the parked car in front of the house for a moment. She looked at the front of it the way it looked now compared to how it had looked the day they first walked up to it. The paint was new on the porch. The first floor windows were intact and clean. The porch step she'd rebuilt herself in October held steady under anyone who walked it. She had built that. With her own hands and YouTube tutorials and stubbornness, in the specific determination of someone who had nowhere else to put her energy. It was real. It was genuinely hers in a way that had nothing to do with the deed. She went inside. She called Sorrel. The agent answered on the second ring. Celia said, I want to resolve this. I need full immunity in writing before I disclose anything. I have 3 children. A pause. Sorrel said, I'll need to bring in my supervisor and coordinate with Treasury. I can't give you that on a phone call. She said, how long? Sorrel said a week, maybe less. In the meantime, don't move anything and don't sell anything. She said, all right. She said, Mrs. Morse, you're doing the right thing. Celia said, I know. She said it without asking for reassurance, just as a fact. A thing she had decided was true and was going to remain true regardless of what it cost. She had made decisions before that she'd known were right before she fully understood why they were right. This felt like that. The week passed in the particular suspended quality of time that knew something was coming. She worked her shifts at Dunleavy's. She helped Rosie with the reading comprehension exercises that her teacher had sent home patient work that required going through the same paragraph multiple times, which Rosie accepted with equanimity because she understood that some things required multiple passes. She sat with Nadia through 2 debate practice sessions and listened to her daughter construct arguments for positions she didn't fully believe in, because that was the exercise building the muscle of argumentation regardless of personal conviction. And she thought, this is what I have been doing, constructing arguments for positions I don't fully believe in. She did not tell the girls yet. She would tell Nadia first, and she would tell her in full before the process began, because Nadia had asked a direct question and deserved a direct answer before anyone else did. On the 5th day, Sorrel called back. She said, the paperwork is ready. Full immunity in exchange for full cooperation and surrender of all assets. The U.S. Attorney's Office has signed off. We need you to come to Hartford. Celia said, I'll be there tomorrow morning. She called Frank Aldridge that evening and asked if he could sit with the girls after school the next day. He said yes without asking why, the way he always said yes, with the particular lack of conditions that she had come to understand was its own form of care. He didn't ask because he had decided she was a person who asked for help only when she needed it and who would tell him what he needed to know when she was ready. She drove to Hartford alone. The field office was in a building downtown that announced nothing about itself. She passed through security, was given a visitor badge, was escorted to a conference room where Sorrel and Pike and a woman she didn't know from the U.S. Attorney's Office were already seated with a document on the table that was 3 pages long. She read every word. 3 pages. She read them slowly and she understood each clause and she asked one question about the repayment structure and the woman from the U.S. Attorney's Office answered it clearly and she read the section again and then she was satisfied. Then she signed. Sorrel said, "Where is the gold?" She gave them both addresses, the storage unit and the cabin. She gave them the key to the storage unit and the code for the cabin's lockbox. She gave them the name of the shell company and the account numbers and the transaction records she had kept in a folder she'd printed and brought in her bag. Pike opened the folder and looked at the first page and made a small sound that might have been professional admiration. He said, "This is extremely thorough documentation." She said, "I was a nurse. We keep records." They drove to Millhaven with her in the back of the first car. When the storage unit opened, Pike stood in the entrance for a moment without speaking. The containers were stacked the way she'd stacked them, with the methodical order she'd imposed because order was how she managed things that were otherwise unmanageable. Sorrel said, "How much did you sell?" She said approximately 40% of the original volume. All transactions are in the folder. Sorrel looked at the containers. She said, "You know what this is worth?" Celia said, "I have an approximate number." Sorrel said, "The original theft was valued at $50 million at 1987 prices. Current value is closer to $15 million for what's here. What you sold accounts for approximately another 6. She said it without judgment. As inventory. As numbers assembled for a report. Celia said, "I know." They processed the storage unit for 2 hours. Then they drove to the cabin. By the time they were done, it was late afternoon, and the light was the low gold of November at 4 o'clock coming through the trees at the angle that made everything look briefly like something worth keeping, which was the particular gift of November light in this part of the country. In the car driving back to Hartford, Sorrel said Victor Shaw's remains have been formally identified and his family has been notified. His wife remarried 20 years ago. His daughter is 40 years old. She lives in Arizona. Celia said, "I read about her when I was researching at the library. She was 2 when he died." Sorrel said, "She's been asking for information for most of her life. There's no good version of this story for her. But there's a version where she knows what happened, and that's better than the one she had before." Celia said, "I know." She said it the same way she'd said it to Sorrel on the phone, not seeking comfort, just acknowledging what was true. The woman from the U.S. Attorney's Office was waiting at the field office when they returned. More paperwork. Questions about the shell company, the transactions, the buyers she'd used. Celia answered everything. She had been a nurse. She had been trained to be accurate under pressure, to give information completely and in the correct order, to not let the difficulty of the situation compromise the quality of the account. By the time it was done, it was past 7. Sorrel walked her to the parking garage. She said, "The immunity agreement covers everything you've disclosed today. You won't be prosecuted. You'll need to repay the proceeds from the sales through a structured arrangement that Treasury will set up. But given the circumstances, there's significant flexibility in the timeline." She said, "You bought a dollar house because your children had nowhere to sleep. I'm not going to pretend that context doesn't matter." Celia said, "It doesn't change what I did." Sorrel said, "No, it doesn't. But it matters in how we think about what happens next." She paused. She said, "There's one more thing. Helen Foster, the CEO of Cascade Mining, has requested a meeting with you. The company has a finder's fee policy, 20% of recovered asset value. It applies here." Celia stopped walking. Sorrel said, "It's standard corporate policy, fully legal, taxable income. She's asking to meet you in person." Celia said, "Why?" Sorrel said, "I think you should let her tell you that herself." She drove home in the dark. She was tired in the way she'd been tired after long hospital shifts, the specific exhaustion of having been fully present for a sustained period, of having been called upon for everything you had and having given everything you had. The house was lit from inside when she turned onto Maple Street. The porch light was on. Through the front window, she could see the kitchen light and the silhouette of movement. She sat in the parked car for a moment. She looked at the house. Then she went inside. The girls were at the kitchen table. Tilly was drawing. Rosie was eating an apple with the focused determination of someone who had decided this apple was the most important thing currently happening. Boone was at the stove, which was unexpected, making something that involved onions and apparently a knowledge of where the kitchen equipment was kept, which suggested he had spent time in this kitchen before. He looked at her when she came in. She nodded. He turned back to the stove. She sat down at the table. Rosie said, "Mama Boone made soup." She said, "I can see that." Rosie said, "It has noodles." She said, "The best kind." Nadia came in from the hallway. She had her debate notes in one hand and looked at Celia with the direct assessment of someone who had been waiting. Celia said, "Come sit down, both of you." Nadia sat. Rosie climbed into her chair. Tilly looked up from her drawing. Celia said, "I went to Hartford today. I met with the FBI. I gave them everything I found in the basement. All of it. Every piece I hadn't already sold and all the records of what I had sold. She said I had found gold in that hidden room. A lot of it. I kept it for about 3 months. I used some of it to fix the house and to make sure we could stay here. And then I stopped, and today I gave it back. She said I should have done it immediately. I didn't, and I'm not going to make the decision sound better than it was." Silence. Rosie said, "Is the gold like pirate's treasure?" She said, "A little like that." Rosie said, "Did you have to give the pirate's treasure back?" She said, "Yes, because it wasn't ours." Rosie considered this with the gravity the situation deserved. She turned it over in the way she turned over information that required processing her face, making small movements as she worked through it. She said, "That's fair." Tilly was looking at her across the table, not drawing now, just looking with the precise attention she gave to things she was trying to understand completely. Celia said, "Tilly, I know you noticed things were different. I know you noticed I was different." Tilly said, "I know you were trying to take care of us." She said it without absolution, just as a fact the way she stated facts. She said, "I drew you a new picture." She slid the paper across the table. Same composition as before. Celia in the center, Nadia to the left, Tilly and Rosie to the right, the house behind them. Everyone's face complete. This time, Celia's face in the drawing had all of it, eyes, nose, and a mouth that was doing what Tilly had seen her mouth do before all of this, the whole face kind, the one that went all the way up to the eyes, the one that matched. Celia held the drawing. She held it for a moment, and she understood what her 10-year-old was telling her, that she looked like herself again, that whatever Tilly had been watching change had changed back, that the drawing was an observation, not a hope, an accurate report. She looked at Nadia. Nadia said, "You answered my question." She said, "Yes." Nadia said, "Okay." She picked up her debate notes and she went back to work with the straightforward resolution of someone who had held a concern for a long time and could now put it down because the question had been answered and the answer was sufficient. She did not make more of it than it was. She did not make less. Boone put soup bowls on the table. They ate. The soup was good. He had apparently been in this kitchen more often than she'd realized and had developed an accurate understanding of where things were kept and what the stove's particular quirks were. Rosie approved enthusiastically. Tilly noted that the noodles were the right kind. Nadia ate with the calm efficiency she brought to everything. After dinner, while Boone was helping Tilly with a math problem at the counter, and Nadia was explaining something about the Roman Empire to Rosie, who had asked a question that led there by a path only Rosie knew. Celia sat at the table and she looked at her family. Not all the ways it was incomplete, not all the ways it had changed shape from what she had planned, from what she had expected when she was 26 and getting married and believing in a version of the future that had not arrived. Just what was there. What she had built and kept building even when she had no idea it was going to hold. Rosie looked at her from across the table. She said, "Mama, can I say grace?" They did not do this regularly. They did it sometimes at holidays, at moments when Rosie felt the occasion called for it. Celia had come to understand that Rosie had an accurate instinct for occasions. She was the most emotionally precise person in the family which was impressive in a 7-year-old, and probably said something about what she'd witnessed in the past year. She said, of course. They reached for each other's hands. Boone to Nadia's left, Rosie's small hand in Celia's right, Tilly's hand in her left. A circle around the table, the second-hand ceramic plates, the noodle soup, the drawing of the family with all the faces complete. Rosie bowed her head. She said, "Thank you for our house that was broken and got fixed. Thank you for the people who ate cereal for dinner and didn't complain." Tilly made a small sound that was almost a laugh. Rosie continued, "Thank you for Frank next door, who waters his plants and lets me help. Thank you for Boone, who fixes pipes and brings ice cream." She paused. She said, "Thank you for the scary things that turned into good things. Thank you for mamas who are brave even when they make mistakes. Thank you for all the other families who are going to get a house someday." She said, "Amen." Everyone said amen. Rosie looked up, satisfied with the quality of the grace. She said, "I said the part about the other families because of what you told us, about the idea." Celia had told them 2 nights ago. Not the formal version, not with all the details, but the shape of it, that she wanted to use the finder's fee to buy abandoned houses and fix them and sell them to families who needed them the way their family had needed this one. That the money had come from something hard, and she wanted to turn it into something real. Nadia had asked how many houses. Tilly had asked who picked the families. Rosie had asked if the families could have dogs. The answer to all 3 questions was, "We're figuring it out." But the figuring out had begun. She had called Helen Foster with the question the morning after the Hartford meeting, and Helen had said she'd been hoping Celia would call. Cascade Mining had a community development program looking for exactly this kind of partnership. Frank Aldridge, who had worked in the assessor's office for 20 years and knew every abandoned property in Riverton by address and history, had offered to help identify candidates. Boone had said he'd coordinate the renovation work and that he knew 3 other contractors who would do the same, people who did good work and were interested in work that had a different kind of meaning attached to it. And Sorrel, in what she called an unofficial capacity, had suggested the organizational structure. She had the look of someone who had spent 17 years watching assets get recovered and returned to corporations and had been waiting for a different version of the story. One house, that was where they were starting. One house identified, owned by the city, taxes unpaid since 2019, structurally sound in the way that Celia now understood how to assess. A small ranch on Gilmore Street that needed a new roof and new plumbing and fresh paint and a front door that didn't stick. One family selected from the applications. A woman named Sandra with 2 teenage boys who worked nights at the hospital as an aide and had been on the waiting list for affordable housing for 3 years and had not stopped trying, not once, not even when the list moved so slowly it seemed stationary. The closing was in 2 weeks. She was going to hand Sandra a key and $1 and say, "This is yours now. Take care of it." 3 days later, Celia drove to a hotel in Hartford and met Helen Foster in a conference room that had the neutral quality of rooms built for conversations that needed neutral ground. Helen Foster was in her late 50s with silver hair and the bearing of someone who had earned her authority through performance rather than inheritance and had not forgotten what the earning cost. She stood when Celia came in and offered her hand, and her grip was direct. She said, "Mrs. Morse, thank you for coming." They sat. Helen said, "I want to tell you something before we discuss the formal details. Victor Shaw was my cousin's husband. Lily, his daughter, is my goddaughter. I've watched her grow up with a gap in her life that had no explanation, only an absence. For 38 years. She said it plainly, not manipulatively, not to generate sympathy. As context, the way you gave context that was relevant to the conversation. She said, "When the FBI called us about the recovery, they told me that the anonymous tip that led to the identification of Victor's remains came from the property's current owner. You could have said nothing. You had every reason to say nothing. You said something anyway." Celia said, "He deserved to be found." Helen said, "Yes, he did." She opened the folder in front of her. She said Cascade Mining's finder's fee policy is 20% of recovered asset value. That's not a gesture. It's standard industry practice, and it applies to the gold you recovered and surrendered. The calculation is based on what was recovered. She turned the page to face Celia. A number. Celia looked at it. She said that's, Helen said, legal, taxable, yours. She said, this is not a reward for keeping the gold. To be very clear, this is the standard fee for recovery of stolen assets, applied as our policy requires. What you did in between is between you and the federal government, and you've resolved that. She said, what this is, Mrs. Morse, is the system working the way it was built to work. Imperfectly, and after a long time, but working. Celia looked at the number. She thought about $87. She thought about the Kroger parking lot. She thought about Nadia portioning the cereal boxes with the precision of a rationing officer, doing it so automatically it had stopped feeling like sacrifice. She thought about what she'd been willing to do when she'd believed this number was only reachable by doing something wrong. She thought about the distance between who she'd been in September and who she was now. She thought about whether the two were the same person or whether the distance between them was something she would carry. She thought, and here it is, reachable, legitimately, because I did the right thing when I still had time to. She said, can I ask you something? Helen said, of course. She said, Victor Shaw's daughter. Lily, would she be willing to talk to me? Helen looked at her. She said, I believe so. I can ask. She said, I want her to know that I thought about her. When I found what I found, when I made decisions I shouldn't have made. She was there in my thinking, not enough at first, but she was there. And I want her to know that the moment I was ready to look at it clearly, she was the reason I did it. Helen was quiet for a moment. She said, I'll tell her that. She said it with the quietness of someone receiving something significant and understanding that it required care. Celia drove home. She picked up Rosie from Garrison. She stopped at the store. She bought the good pasta, the kind in the blue box and the sauce in the jar, rather than the one in the can, and the Parmesan that came in a solid piece, rather than pre-shredded. She bought a loaf of the bread from the bakery section that was $2 more than the other bread, and that Rosie liked because it had a good crust. She bought it without doing the math first, which was new, which was something she was still getting used to. She made dinner. She set the table with the plates, not the paper ones from the camping supply days, but the second-hand ceramic set she'd found at the thrift store in October, mismatched but real. Each one slightly different, each one chosen from the bin by one of the girls who had opinions about which was best. Nadia did homework at the counter. Tilly arranged the silverware in the configuration she had decided was correct: knife on the right and spoon outside the knife, because she had read somewhere this was proper and had applied it without comment ever since. Rosie folded the paper towels into triangles because she had watched a YouTube video about napkin folding and taken it seriously. Boone came at 6. He'd been doing this more often now, not imposed, not assumed, but present when it made sense. He brought the dessert, which was ice cream, because he had asked Rosie what they should have for dessert, and Rosie had an extremely clear answer. They ate. After while Boone was helping Tilly with a math problem, and Nadia was explaining something about the Roman Empire to Rosie, who had asked without quite understanding what she was asking for, Celia sat at the table and she looked at her family. Not all the ways it was incomplete. Not all the ways it had changed shape from what she had planned. Just what was there. What she had built and kept building even when she had no idea it was going to hold. Lily Shaw called on a Sunday. She called in the late morning when the girls were at Frank's helping him plant the winter bulbs he'd been talking about since October, explaining to each of them the particular requirements of each bulb, the depth and the spacing and the preparation of the soil. And Rosie was filing this information alongside the names of the 7 plants she'd already learned. Celia was sitting on the back porch with coffee, looking at the yard she'd been slowly clearing since September. Arizona number, she answered. Lily Shaw had a warm voice, the voice of someone who had processed enormous things and come out the other side with their warmth intact, which was not easy and was not nothing. She said she was 40 years old. She said she had been 2 when her father disappeared, and that her whole life she had known only the shape of the absence, not the fact. She said, "My mother got a call 2 weeks ago from the FBI. She had a long cry, and then she had the best night's sleep she'd had in 30 years. She said she felt like a window that had been stuck finally open." Celia said, "I'm so sorry for all of it." Lily said, "You couldn't have known when you bought the house. You couldn't have known any of it." Celia said, "No, but I could have done better once I did know. And I want you to understand that I thought about you. When I was making decisions that were wrong, you were in my thinking even when I was making the wrong choice. And the moment I was ready to make the right one, you were the reason." Lily was quiet, a quiet that was not empty, the quiet of someone holding something. She said, "My Aunt Janet told me you said something like that. I wanted to hear it from you." She said, "Can I ask you something?" Celia said, "Yes." She said, "What was he like, the room? Was it—" She stopped. She said, "I've thought about this for 40 years. What the last place he was looked like. Whether it was—" She stopped again. Celia thought about the stone room, the careful stacking of the containers, the dim and the cold. She thought about what a nurse knew that other people didn't know about what bodies could tell you and what they couldn't about what 40 years underground in stone and cold did and did not do, and what that meant about the nature of suffering and the end of it. She said, "It was over quickly. From everything I saw when I was there, from everything I know from my work, it was over before the isolation. He didn't suffer long." She said it carefully, and she said it true. She said what was accurate and what she believed, and what would give this woman something solid to hold. There was a silence on the line. Then Lily said, "Thank you." She said it the way you said something to a person who had just given you something you'd been waiting for a very long time and had stopped believing you were going to get. Celia held the phone. She said, "Your father deserved to be found. He deserved to have his family know what happened to him. I'm glad I could give you that even late." They talked for 40 more minutes about Lily's work, which was community development, the financing side of affordable housing projects. About her husband, who was an architect who specialized in affordable housing design. About the daughter Lily had 7 years old, who had been told that her grandfather had been a brave man, and that brave men were sometimes taken too soon, but that they stayed with you. Lily said, "My aunt told me about what you're doing, the foundation." Celia said, "We're just starting, one house right now." Lily said, "My husband and I do this work, not the same model, but connected. He designs affordable builds. I work with the financing side. We've been looking for something like what you're describing." She said, "Would you want help? Real help, not advisory, but operational." Celia said, "Yes." She said it without hesitation. Lily said, "Then I'll have him call you this week. His name is David. He's going to ask you a lot of questions, and then he's going to draw about 40 diagrams on whatever paper is available. Fair warning. Celia said I spent 3 months learning home repair from YouTube. I can handle the diagrams." Lily laughed. It was the laugh of someone who had just heard something unexpected that was also in the way that good things were exactly right. They said goodbye. Celia set the phone down on the porch railing, and she looked at the yard and at the tree line at the back of the property and at the sky above Maple Street. That was the clear, hard blue of late November when the temperature had finally committed to itself. She thought about the system she had built in September, the careful distances, the different towns, the documentation she'd kept in a folder she'd told herself was organization, but understood now was something else, a part of her that had not stopped keeping records because a part of her had known from the start that the records were going to be needed. Some portion of herself had been oriented toward this moment the whole time, keeping the records for exactly this purpose. She had always been going to do this. She had just needed the time to get there. She thought about her hands. She held them up in the November light and she looked at them the way she had looked at them every morning for months. The assessment, the inventory, still cracked at the knuckles. Still the left index finger with its scar from the box cutter. Still the faint coffee stain on the inside of the right thumb from 6 months of steaming milk at $7 an hour. But not shaking. Not shaking. She heard the side gate open and the sound of three voices and a fourth, which was Frank, and the particular sound of Rosie's feet on the path, which was a specific rhythm she'd learned to identify, the way she'd learned to identify many things by paying attention, which was the only real method. Rosie's voice came first, and Frank says the hyacinths will smell amazing in April. Then Tilly, what do daffodils look like when they first come up? Then Frank, patient and specific, like a thin green finger coming out of the earth. Then two leaves, then the stalk, then the flower. Then Nadia not asking a question, but adding information. The Greeks thought daffodils grew in the underworld. Then Frank, is that right? Then Nadia, in the myth. Persephone was picking them when Hades, she was still explaining when the gate opened, and the group of them came around the side of the house still talking Baron. If there had been a Baron following Rosie instead, just Rosie herself leading the way with the certainty of a child who knew exactly where she was going. Rosie saw Celia on the porch, and her face did the thing it always did. Immediate, complete the particular quality of her delight that she had not yet learned to moderate. She said, Mama, Frank says the bulbs will be flowers by April. Celia said, that's amazing. Rosie said we put in 47. She said, did you count? Rosie said Tilly counted. Tilly said it's 47. She picked up her coffee. She went inside. She went inside to her house, the one she had bought for $1 when she had nothing else. The one she had fixed with her own hands and stubbornness and YouTube tutorials, and the refusal to stop, the one that was going to be hers and her children's for as long as they needed it, and maybe after the foundation is solid kind of house, the built-on bedrock kind, the kind that had held before she found it and would hold after. She went inside and she started dinner. Behind her, the November yard held its quiet. The 47 bulbs were in the ground. By April, they would be something different. By April, they would be proof that things you put in the dark in October came back differently in spring, came back as something you hadn't been able to fully imagine when you were pressing them into the cold earth with cold hands. The door opened. The sound of her family filled the kitchen. Rosie was already telling her something important about the bulbs and how they went in the ground before winter and came back in spring, which she had decided was a very good system, and which Celia agreed was a very good system, and which Frank had apparently explained with the care of someone who understood that this was not just horticulture, but something larger, something about patience and faith and the willingness to put something in the dark and trust what came back, which was in fact how the best things worked. You put them in the ground in the dark, you trusted the spring, you did the work in between,